racketeering, convictions on both fronts. The prosecutor who litigated that case, a man named John Floyd, defended that conviction of that Georgia sheriff all the way up to the Georgia State Supreme Court, including the racketeering charges, defended it all the way to the top level in Georgia state law. And the case stood up, and that disgraced sheriff and now convicted murderer Sidney Dorsey is still in prison for that crime. Convicted murderer, convicted racketeer. You see racketeering charges brought in Georgia in, also the kinds of cases that maybe seem more intuitive. There was, for example, a big set of arrests in Georgia in October targeting a street gang. They called it Operation Caged Doves, which seems a little melodramatic. But 46 people were arrested and a huge, big, long string of charges brought against all of them. Between them, there were 4 charges of felony murder, 4 charges of kidnapping, 24 charges of aggravated assault, 3 charges of heroin trafficking, 3 charges of meth trafficking, 3 charges of various kinds of financial fraud. But look up at the top, 92 charges of racketeering. They rolled up this whole street gang and charged them with lots of individual crimes, and then charged all of them with violations of the RICO Act, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. And so it is still, you should think of it as a mafia thing, and you should think of it as something that is used against gangs. But it's more than that. In December in Georgia, there were racketeering charges brought against a whole bunch of public officials, including a sheriff's captain, in what was alleged to be a sprawling, corrupt, illegal gambling ring centered at convenience stores and mini-marts in Georgia. In 2019, there was this tidy little thing, racketeering charges brought against 3 people in the town of White, Georgia. The police chief, his son-in-law, and his wife. Racketeering charges were brought against the police chief and his son-in-law, who was the town's only other police officer, and his wife, who was also the town manager. The allegations were that they were basically involved in a planned scheme to give people bogus citations, radically overcharge them for those citations, and then pocket the money. Helps to have the patrol officer, the chief of police, and the town manager all on board in a scheme like that. They were brought up on racketeering charges for that. Racketeering charges, it's a pattern of criminal acts all leading toward a larger criminal purpose. And that charge is a really serious one in a state like Georgia, like 20 years in prison, serious. But that charge turns up in cases of all kinds, including lots of cases involving allegedly corrupt public officials. Perhaps the most surprising and most high-profile case that they turned up in was one that you will remember, the Atlanta schools cheating scandal. Do you remember this? This was national news. It was the top of the national news when 11 educators were convicted in Georgia State Court in that cheating scandal in April 2015.
From NBC News World Headquarters in New York, this is NBC Nightly News. Reporting tonight, Lester Holt.
Good evening. It's bad enough when kids cheat in school to get ahead, but the teachers themselves? Today in Atlanta, nearly a dozen former educators were convicted on racketeering and other charges for their part in one of the nation's biggest cheating scandals. Prosecutors say it was a massive conspiracy to make sure students passed standardized tests, even if it meant giving kids the correct answers. The scandal dates back a decade. It involved dozens of schools and a lot of grown-ups who apparently failed one of the first lessons we were all taught.
Nearly a dozen former educators convicted on racketeering and other charges. Racketeering charges there, too. They weren't a gang. I mean, these are educators, corrupt educators, as was proven in court, but this is 12 teachers and other educators put on trial. This sprawling case accusing them of basically a systematic form of cheating on standardized tests. One of the 12 teachers who was put on trial was acquitted, but 11 of the remaining 12 were convicted, among other things, on racketeering charges, all of them, with that harsh penalty looming for all of them of up to 20 years in prison. That trial in the Atlanta cheating scandal was the longest jury trial in the history of the state of Georgia. And I'm not talking about like the overall proceedings from the first arrest to the first court hearings to the, trial to the sentencing and all the rest of it. I don't mean how long the whole thing took to be resolved. I mean just the trial itself. The day after day in the actual courtroom fighting it out, the trial itself took 6 months. There's never been a longer trial in the state of Georgia with a dozen defendants there. incredibly complex with this incredibly ambitious charge. The prosecutor who led the team, who got those convictions in the Atlanta cheating scandal, was at the time an assistant DA named Fani Willis. Here she is in some tape that we've got from that time. The elected DA is at the microphone there leading the press conference, but you see Fani Willis there on the right side of your screen. She led the prosecution team in the Atlanta cheating scandal. There on the right side there. And interestingly, when they decided to pursue that case that way, when they pursued those charges against the teachers and principals and administrators who were all caught up in this cheating scandal, the prosecution team under Fani Willis brought in a specialist, an expert, a special prosecutor specifically to help them make the racketeering case, to make the case for that specific, very serious felony charge and to see it through to conviction. That's the man, the specialist who they brought in there, the guy on the left. His name is John Floyd, whose name I just said a moment ago, because that is the same John Floyd who had obtained the conviction, the racketeering conviction, against the crooked sheriff, Sidney Dorsey, in that case where Dorsey murdered his would-be successor after he beat him in an election in the year 2000. John Floyd is the one who got that conviction, including the racketeering conviction there, and then defended it all the way up to the Supreme Court, tacked 20 years onto a sentence that was already life without parole because of that racketeering conviction. When years later, Fani Willis was leading the teacher corruption scandal prosecution in Atlanta, she went to him. She brought in the state's racketeering prosecution expert. She brought in John Floyd to get the racketeering convictions against the teachers in that case, too. And it worked. However unlikely it might have seemed to have those kinds of charges in that kind of case, he did it. And it stuck. And it worked. And now, not that many years later, Fani Willis is the elected district attorney herself in the largest county in Georgia, in Fulton County. And Fani Willis has announced the opening of a criminal investigation into efforts by former President Donald Trump and others to corrupt the results of the presidential election in Georgia. She said when she announced the opening of that investigation that racketeering was one of the crimes she was potentially investigating in conjunction with efforts to corrupt the election results. And now Reuters is first to report, and Willis's office has confirmed that Willis has gone back to the same guy. She has gone back to John Floyd, who has had a hand in the highest profile and most unlikely seeming RICO prosecutions in recent Georgia law. John Floyd, who has since gone on to become a nationally respected expert on how to prosecute RICO cases under state law. This is his book. He literally wrote the book on how to prosecute RICO cases. RICO, state by state, a guide to litigation under state racketeering statutes. That's his book. He literally wrote the book on how to prosecute and get convictions on state racketeering laws. Reuters reporting that Fani Willis has, quote, enlisted the help of Atlanta lawyer John Floyd to provide help as needed on matters involving racketeering, including the Trump investigation. The dean of Mercer University Law School in Macon, Georgia, says about this hire, quote, it's not a stretch to see where Fani Willis is taking this. If President Trump engaged in 2 or more acts that involve false statements that were made knowingly and willfully in an attempt to falsify material fact, like the election results, then you can piece together a violation of the Racketeering Act. Noting that racketeering is a felony in Georgia and it can carry penalties up to 20 years in prison, the dean says, quote, there are not a lot of people who avoid serving prison time on a racketeering offense. It is honestly a shocking thing that the immediate former president of the United States is facing multiple live criminal investigations by New York state prosecutors, by Georgia state prosecutors. CNN and the Wall Street Journal and other news organizations have recently reported on even more Trump properties and developments and financial entanglements that have been subpoenaed recently as part of the New York criminal investigation. The New York investigation has itself brought on an experienced mob prosecutor as a special prosecutor to help them with their work there. But if Georgia is looking at a potential racketeering case against the former president, now with the help of a specialist prosecutor who does this for a living, who has already successfully brought super high-profile racketeering prosecutions in that state and earned convictions on those charges, this just feels like a different level of the sort of drama and risk stratosphere here. There's a lot going on in the news right now. This is mind-blowing, though. Joining us now is